Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that focuses on some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, but also highlights their history, culture, and geopolitics. Today, we are going to continue our three-episode series on England, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, whatever you want to call it. And by the way, let me just clear something up because I've had some questions after my last episode. When we refer to England, we refer to a country, the country of England. When we refer the to Great Britain, we refer to England, Britain, and Scotland. When we refer to the United Kingdom, we refer to England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And so that will hopefully clear up some confusion about those terms in case I inadvertently use them interchangeably, which I shouldn't. But that happens when I get into the flow of the discussion. Sometimes I might juxtapose one for the other. So I'm going to apologize in advance for that. But I've had a good time really digging into this series because I have so many really good memories of my visits to England. And I say England because I have not been to Scotland or to Northern Ireland, and so or Wales, by the way. So my focus is really on England itself, where I've had just amazing experiences. And as I said, before we get really into the flow of the discussion of the leaders of England over the past years since Winston Churchill, I want to respond to another question that I received, and that is British food as bad as everyone says it is? And the question and the answer to that really is it's probably not as bad as people say it is. I've had some very nice meals in England, especially in London. Had some of the best shepherd's pie that I've ever eaten in Bath, England. Um, I've had amazing fish and chips throughout the country. You link fish and chips with England in many ways. But London has so many international type restaurants, whether it's Indian or whether it is Middle Eastern, whether it is French or international cuisine. There's really something for everyone. And there are a growing number of Michelin star restaurants in London and outside of London as well now. So I would say that the almost constant bashing of British food is a little bit overstated. Now, it might not be British food per se; it may be food in Britain. But I have never had what I consider to be a horrible meal on the island. Another question that I wanted to respond to quickly is how do the British really feel about Americans? And I think that this is always a tough question for any country because it's very subjective. The only perspective I can give you is from the experiences that I've had there and the people that I know there who are acquaintances or friends of mine. And I will say that most of my experiences, a great majority of my experiences in the UK have been very good. They've been accommodating. I remember one evening striking up a conversation with an elderly couple on the tube and having just a beautiful conversation about their lives and England the way that it was previously. I've never felt unsafe in England. We've traveled many places within the confines of the country, never felt unsafe at all. Had a number of really great interactions with people there. And I think that in many cases, the British are like those of other countries, citizens of other countries in Europe, and they believe what they see on the media, which at least in most recent times has not always been favorable to the United States, and they begin to believe that. Right? They believe what they hear on the BBC or CNN International or Al Jazeera, and they it skews their perception, I think, sometimes of the Americans. Uh, I get a joke when I'm there a lot, especially from my friends, of all you Americans are cowboys. Well, um, we're not all cowboys, of course. That's part of our culture, but it is a only a part of the American culture. But what they see there in their media and in their daily appetite of news is sometimes very much skewed to what is actually happening. And of course, it skews attitudes to a certain degree. The only really negative interaction that we've ever had in England is when we were flying in from Cyprus on one occasion. Um, Debbie had a situation in immigration with a very rude immigration officer who asked why we didn't have a Cyprus residency if we lived in Cyprus. And of course, we could not have it because the agreement that I was working with the Turkish Cypriots in the south. And so the agreement that the United States had with the Republic of Cyprus, which is the Greek controlled portion of Cyprus, is that we had to live on the Greek side. I worked on the Turkish side, and and we couldn't have residency, but every 3 months we would take a flight outside the country and renew um, our residency stay. And once this was explained to the immigration officer in at Heathrow Airport in London, he still wasn't buying into it. And I remember his colleague looking at him and saying, "Look, the lady just explained it. It makes perfect sense. Just check yourself and let her go." And he did that. And the rest of our trip was lovely. So it was just, I don't know whether he was having a bad day or whether he was had some issue with Americans, but that's really the only negative interaction we've ever had. The violence that you hear of today, especially the violence perpetrated by immigrants, I never experienced that at all. London, especially, is a very cosmopolitan city, as are Birmingham, Liverpool, and others. But uh, this is an increasing issue in Britain, and we'll talk more about it on this podcast. Actually, it's an issue that is really a flashpoint in their society now. This issue of immigration and the crime that at least they feel has been an outcome of that flow of immigration, but never experienced it ourselves at all. One other question that I'll answer before we get into this, what will hopefully be an interesting overview of British leadership over the years, is uh, how did British Airways go from being an outstanding airline to what it is today, which is really one of the poorest rated airlines in the world? Well, I would say that COVID played a big role in that. And to their credit, British Airways leadership has acknowledged that they are having severe problems. I quit flying British Airways a long time ago, even before COVID. But after COVID, I've been told that they had all types of operational issues. Their fleet was old. They lost a lot of staff during COVID. They've been unable to rehire and retrain staff. They've been cash poor. I hear recently they got a £7 billion infusion of cash into the airline to help upgrade their equipment, uh, deal with some of their staffing issues, etc. But we also have to realize that this is a publicly subsidized airline. All of the employees are union. Um, they have frequent labor issues. And typically, nationally subsidized airlines don't work because they ultimately because they have no connection to the free market. This is why deregulation of air service in the United States, which happened decades ago, was so important because it sets these airlines up as private companies. So they have to operate in a lean environment. They have to focus on that bottom line, whereas nationally subsidized airlines don't always have to do that. So British Airways is making somewhat of a comeback, but it has not been a very pleasant experience to fly BA over the last several years. So if you're thinking of going to the UK, I'd probably focus on Delta or KLM, fly into Amsterdam, and then take that easy, either an easy flight or an easy train ride to the UK. But probably avoid BA if you can. That being said, now we're going to jump into the topic of today's episode, which is taking a look at British leadership since Winston Churchill. And as an offshoot of this session, I want to just tell you that I had the opportunity to brief to do a briefing for members of the House of Lords recently on issues relative to the brickmaking industry in Pakistan. It's a long story, but that I'll tell sometime. But um, as I was conducting the briefing, I thought of how strange it was that a kid from rural Oklahoma, being someone who could brief members of the House of Lords on anything, let alone the intricacies of a key economic sector in Pakistan. It was truly surreal to have that experience. And as an offshoot of that session, I had the opportunity to talk in detail with a member of the House of Lords about the history of British politics. It's something that's always fascinated me, and he beautifully led me through the strengths and weaknesses of Britain's modern prime ministers and their impact on the country's economy and governance. So today I want to share in very brief, in a very brief way, some of those observations, since the understanding of Britain's leadership over the years, especially at number 10 Downing Street, is instrumental in understanding the country itself. So, this episode is a story about Britain's leaders since Winston Churchill, their strengths, their flaws, and the way the public perceived them. And I'll throw in some of my observations as an onlooker and a foreigner as well. Before we get into the specific prime ministers, we need to understand that prime ministers are not monarchs. They don't reign, they govern. They don't symbolize continuity, they wrestle with change. They are elected, scrutinized, praised, criticized, and sometimes pushed out by their own party. They carry the weight of a nation's expectations, and they do it in real time, under real pressure, with real consequences. From Winston Churchill to Keir Starmer, each prime minister reflects the mood of the era, the hopes, the fears, the conflicts of the British people. Their stories are not just political, they're human. And most of you probably know that Britain is a constitutional monarchy, meaning that the real power of government sits with the prime minister, who is the the senior elected government official, lives at number 10 Downing Street. And the monarch itself, himself or herself, is the symbolic head of government. When a new prime minister is elected, the first thing that prime minister does is meet with the monarch, which is now, of course, King Charles, and is allowed to form a government. Of course, allowed in this case is fairly pro forma, because there has not been a time, at least in the recent history of Britain, where the monarch has refused to allow a prime minister to form a government. And so it's a fairly symbolic meeting, but it's one that always occurs. That's the first thing a newly elected prime minister does. And remember, a prime minister is not elected by a majority of, it's not like our president that is elected by a majority of vote of the people in the country. A party wins an election. Currently, the Labour Party governs. And within the Labour Party, they elect a prime minister, or the Conservative Party, or whatever party is in power. So it's a much different, it's a parliamentary form of government. So which means that when an election occurs, a party is either given a mandate outright, or if that mandate is not given outright, then they have to form a coalition government with other parties to actually form a government. It's a much different system than in the United States. That's why you hear things like snap elections. In the United States, we wouldn't have a snap election. Whoever's elected president of the United States governs for 4 years, and then an election occurs to either re-elect that person or to elect a replacement. But in a parliamentary form of government, snap elections, which mean quick elections that are caused by some change, whether cataclysmic or not, in government, occur regularly. And as a matter of fact, the UK may be headed for a snap election in the very near future, as Keir Starmer, of course, has resigned as prime minister. So that's a little bit of an overview, just to get you oriented on how the British political system works. So now let's start with these iconic figures who have served as prime minister over the years. And of course, a great place to start here is with Winston Churchill, who was prime minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945, and from 1951 to 55. I've read a lot about Winston Churchill, and I personally have a great deal of respect for the man. Churchill was somewhat of an enigma wrapped in a riddle. He was arguably one of the greatest wartime leaders, not just in England's history, but quite possibly in world history. Uh, a leader who galvanized the public at a time when the country was really under siege by the Wehrmacht, the Nazi regime in World War II. Churchill became the voice of the nation. He became the conscience of the nation. He became the motivator of the nation. And of course, virtually anyone, whether they're British or not, remembers his famous statement that we will fight on the air, in the air, we will fight on the ground, we'll fight on the beaches, we'll never, ever surrender. And that became a rally cry for Britain during one of the darkest periods of his history, during the London Blitz, during all the bombings, during the siege of Dunkirk, through all of the highs and lows in that period between 1940 and 45, Winston Churchill was the iconic figure that led Britain through that maze. Churchill entered history like a thunderclap. When he became prime minister in 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France had already fallen. The United States was not yet in the war. The Luftwaffe was preparing to bomb London. And Churchill stepped forward with a voice that sounded like courage itself. His strengths were unmistakable. Churchill was a master of language, a man who understood that words could be weapons. As I said, his "we shall never surrender" statement is among the most iconic in history. His resolve was unshakable. His strategic vision forged the alliance with the United States that ultimately won the war. If I was comparing Winston Churchill to any current leader, I would probably say Vladimir Zelensky. Because Vladimir Zelensky has proven himself to be an outstanding wartime leader. He has a lot of um, Churchillian traits as far as a leader, because he's galvanized the people of Ukraine against a common enemy. He has motivated them. He has stood with them. He's become the face and the voice of Ukraine internationally. And his dynamism and his courage has galvanized the world with Ukraine against this common enemy. And that's exactly what Churchill did in the 1940s. But also, like Churchill, Zelensky's record in peacetime has not been as sterling, so to speak. As a matter of fact, before the full scale invasion in 2022, the Zelensky government was under a great deal of criticism because things were not going well. And this is a hallmark of Churchill's administrations also, because Churchill had so many strengths, amazing strengths, especially as an orator. But his weaknesses were equally real. He was a man of empire in a world that was moving beyond empire. His domestic policies were often rigid, outdated, and indifferent to social change. And his second term in the 1950s really lacked the fire of his wartime leadership. As a matter of fact, Churchill's legacy would probably have been better off if his second term as prime minister had never happened. Because then people would have only remembered the wartime Churchill, the cigar smoking, smooth talking orator who led Britain through its darkest time. Now that's tempered somewhat with the real challenges that he faced in his second term as prime minister. And that's made public perception of his leadership complex. He's revered as a wartime hero, yet modern historians scrutinize his imperial views and controversial decisions. Churchill's both a myth and a man, and Britain remembers him as both. I think one thing that makes Churchill interesting as well is his close relationship with Queen Elizabeth. Remember, during this period of war, Queen Elizabeth was a very young monarch, a queen that was never meant to be a queen, because if her uncle had not abdicated the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, thereby leading to her father's ascension to the throne, it's quite possible rather, that Queen Elizabeth would never have become the monarch, because her uncle was a younger man. If he hadn't fallen for Wallis Simpson and married according to more traditional standards for the royals, he was quite young enough to father children. And any child that he had, boy or girl, would have superseded both his brother and Queen Elizabeth in the in the line of succession. So the fact that Queen Elizabeth became queen at all was quite, some could say, an accident of history, but it was a pleasant accident of history, because she is the longest reigning monarch in the history not only of England, but in the history of Europe, or was until her death. And because she was young during this period of darkness in Britain, when they were under attack by Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill became somewhat of a guiding light for her. He became a mentor for her. He became someone that she could depend on and trust. And the relationship that this young monarch built with Winston Churchill was lifelong, and it was unbreakable. Elizabeth always revered Winston Churchill. It was one of the closest relationships between a monarch and a prime minister that I personally have seen in my research of governments that are similar in form. As Churchill ended his first term as prime minister in 1945, as the war came to a close, Clement Attlee became prime minister. And Attlee, if you could sum Attlee up, you would say he was the quiet revolutionary. Because if Churchill was thunder, Attlee was quiet rain. He was soft-spoken. He was modest. He was almost invisible in public. But Attlee nonetheless transformed Britain more profoundly than any prime minister before or since. In some ways, he was the exact right person to lead Britain through this period after World War II, when it was reconstructing not just its infrastructure and its economy, but its society itself. For instance, Attlee created the National Health Service, a system that remains one of Britain's most cherished institutions. Now, you've heard me say before, and this is not a rant or something that I'm just pulling out of thin air. Uh, I have many good friends in England, and I've done a lot of research also on the National Health Service, and it has some very significant deficiencies. But when it was began by Clement Attlee, the National Health Service was really something that was timely, it was effective, it was important, and it was an example for other countries. And that's why it's still revered today, even with all the frustration, even with all the bureaucracy and the waste and the drama that surrounds the NHS. It remains a cherished institution in Britain. And quite possibly because it's so cherished, it has fallen victim to its own legacy, if you will, because it's not the same institution that Clement Attlee started, and certainly has not progressed in the way likely that he would have liked to have seen it progress. So Attlee expanded the welfare state for good or for bad. At the time that he did it, it was likely the right move in post-war Britain. But of course, when you start that welfare state, people become used to it. They take on a different mentality toward government's role in the economy and in society. And it's very hard then to step away from that. But establishing this welfare state allowed Clement Attlee to rebuild the nation after the war and to guide Britain through the early years of decolonization. Those were Attlee's strengths: his quiet determination, his ability to calmly and efficiently navigate the plethora of issues that faced Britain after the Second World War. But he had specific weaknesses as well, and they were tied to that era. He struggled to get the economy rolling again. There was a lot of rationing, there was austerity. But his achievements in other areas tended to overshadow those. The Clement Attlee's legacy is still very much alive today, especially in terms of the welfare state and the NHS, which continue to be, depending on which side you're on, either enduring legacies or something that now has become an anchor to Britain's economy and to its governance. What was the public perception of Clement Attlee? Well, it's grown over time. He was once seen as dull, but now he's recognized as one of Britain's most effective leaders. Proof that quiet competence can change a nation. So we had Churchill from 1940 to 45, then Clement Attlee from 45 to 51, and then Churchill again from 51 to 55. And as I said before, Churchill's second term as prime minister from 1951 to 55 was not smooth. It created a lot of division and criticism, and likely undercut his overall legacy. So when he moved off the scene in 1955, the next prime minister was Harold Macmillan, who served in that role from 1957 to 1963. If you were summing up Macmillan, you would likely call him a gentleman of the old order. Macmillan governed during a period of relative stability. You're somewhat removed from the war then, 12 years or so removed from the end of the war. Clement Attlee's government had presided over the Reconstruction period and a lot of the decolonization period, not all of it, but some. And so Macmillan projected calm during the Cold War. He oversaw growth. He managed the complex processes of decolonization. He used the phrase often that said, "You've never had it so good." And that became really the catchphrase of this era in Britain because it captured the optimism of the era. Of course, when people today, especially those outside of Britain who don't know a lot about its recent political leadership, a lot of what people remember about Harold Macmillan, if they remember him at all, is the Profumo affair, which was a huge scandal that he was not involved in directly, but happened under his leadership. And I think it's important to understand what the Profumo affair was and how it affected Macmillan's leadership. This scandal happened in 1963 when John Profumo, who was then British Secretary of War, was revealed to have had an affair with Christine Keeler, a 19-year-old model. Now, that alone likely would have created some laughter at dinner parties or some raised eyebrows or even some scorn within the halls of Parliament. But the scandal exploded not because of this affair, but because Christine Keeler was also having an affair with Yevgeny Ivanov, who was a Soviet naval attaché. And this raised fears that Profumo had compromised national security. To make it worse, Profumo initially lied to Parliament, insisting that there had been no impropriety. When the truth emerged, he resigned in disgrace. It was a combination of sex, espionage, and political deception that made the story irresistible. And then, of course, tied up in this story were the key figures, of course, Profumo, who was the senior cabinet minister, Christine Keeler, who was this young model, Yevgeny Ivanov, who was a Soviet diplomat, but also a gentleman by the name of Stephen Ward, who was an osteopath and a socialite who introduced Keeler to Profumo and later was prosecuted and died during the trial. It's widely believed that Stephen Ward was the scapegoat. Profumo was never, outside of being disgraced and having to leave government, he was never put on trial for any type of crime. Christine Keeler did, in fact, serve several months in prison. I think it was between 6 and 8 months in prison. Ivanov was summarily sent outside the country and finished his career in Russia and repaired his reputation with the Russian elite. But Stephen Ward, this osteopath who made the initial connection between Profumo and Keeler, really bore the blame, if you will, for this whole affair. And it's widely believed now that that should not have happened and that he was unfairly tried and convicted. He actually died during the trial. And Stephen Ward's story is a very tragic story that's embedded in this whole scandal. And then, of course, there was Harold Macmillan, who was the prime minister. Um, this scandal led to Cold War paranoia. It disclosed the class hypocrisy that was endemic in British society. It undermined the government's credibility. And it really forced media transformation. The British press became more aggressive, less deferential, and more willing to expose the private lives of public figures. And so this happened while Profumo, or while Macmillan was prime minister. And it was something that really tainted his government. Macmillan was a very, if not stoic, certainly deeply immersed in the socialite culture of Britain. As I said, he was a gentleman of the old order. And so this was a very embarrassing situation for this to happen under his watch. And he was furious with Profumo that this had occurred. Drummed him out of government. Later on, they did reconcile in later years. But it so ran contrary to Macmillan's leadership style because he was an aristocrat. He had a very paternal leadership style. And ultimately, that style felt increasingly out of step with a changing Britain. So public perception of Macmillan was warm, but it was distant. He was remembered. He's probably best remembered today as a steady hand, but a gentleman of another age. Again, he had a good relationship with the monarch, Queen Elizabeth. Certainly not a relationship like she had with Churchill, but it was a cordial relationship. She, better than most, could understand Macmillan's worldview as an aristocrat. And that paternal style that he had, and that sense of duty that he had, because that's the world that she came from. That's the world that she lived in. And her style was very much like that. She believed in a life of service. And she eschewed scandals and did everything possible to not air dirty laundry in public, because that was simply not done in polite society. And that's why this Profumo affair was so debilitating to Macmillan and likely dampened somewhat his legacy. So after Macmillan, the next prime minister was Harold Wilson. And Harold Wilson had 2 terms as prime minister. His first term was from 1964 to 1970, and his second term was from 1974 to 76. Harold Wilson, if you summed up his style, his worldview, you would probably call him the modernizer. Harold Wilson brought Britain into the modern era. He stepped beyond this cloistered environment that Macmillan lived in and really embraced a changing Britain. Wilson expanded education. He promoted technology. He tried to steer the country through social and economic turbulence. And he had a supreme amount of political intelligence and adaptability. He was very innovative for his time. However, he had marked weaknesses as well, such as inflation, union unrest, and economic stagnation. And that tainted his legacy somewhat. And this encapsulated both of his terms as prime minister. Unlike Churchill, who had one term of prime minister that was both iconic and probably considered to be one of the most successful in history in leading the country through the darkness of World War II. And then a second term where the challenges of peacetime really exposed some of the gaps in Churchill's leadership. The difference with Wilson is that both of his terms were very similar from the standpoint of his approach and his worldview and his perception. They had specific strengths, specific weaknesses, and those strengths and weaknesses were manifested equally in both terms. And that's why public perception of Wilson in Britain is mixed. He was seen as clever and pragmatic, but his legacy lacks the clarity of more dramatic leaders. As a matter of fact, I will tell you in the discussions that I've had with my friends in Britain, Wilson's name has really never came up. It did in the conversation I had with this member of the House of Lords, but in conversation with just average British citizens, many of whom understand British history very well, there's not much discussion of Wilson, actually. So after Wilson's second term, you had a woman came to power who was one of the most iconic leaders of Britain in history. And that, of course, is the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, who ruled from 1979 to 1990, longest term of any British prime minister in modern times. She was called the Iron Lady for a reason. And that's because Margaret Thatcher had a very specific view of the world. And she was unwilling to alter her view of the world, which in equal measure was a strength, but also a weakness. It created a pocket of very big support in Britain and also major opposition. Margaret Thatcher is one of the most polarizing figures in the history of the island. To her credit, she reshaped the nation's economy. She confronted the unions. She privatized industries. She projected a fierce global posture. She was really the antithesis of someone like Clement Attlee, who was very much involved in developing social programs and public assistance institutions like the NHS, etc. Margaret Thatcher was a conservative, and she was not afraid to stand up to the social structure and the political structure to put in place her vision of what Britain should be. Margaret Thatcher's leadership style was uncompromising, ideological, and deeply personal. And her relationship with the Queen reflected this. Queen Elizabeth was all about adaptability and the proper order of things and duty and service. The Queen was apolitical. The nature of the monarch in Britain, because of the shape of the form of government, is apolitical. But Margaret Thatcher was a very political. Everything to Margaret Thatcher was politics. She loved to play hardball. She loved to get down and dirty. She loved to counterpunch when someone punched. And she loved to punch and wait for somebody to counterpunch. She was truly the Iron Lady. And this initially put off the Queen because it was so different than Queen Elizabeth's worldview. But actually, later on, during Thatcher's term, Margaret Thatcher and the Queen, while they still had their issues, they came to somewhat of an understanding of each other. And I think that I'm not in the inner circle enough to know whether that ever became a overly cordial relationship, but it was certainly a relationship based on respect. And quite frankly, it would have been challenging to have a cordial relationship with Margaret Thatcher because she wasn't that type of person. She cooked her own meals. She welcomed her own guests. She was very much different than the aristocratic leaders who had come before her. She came from the world of hard knocks, and she took that attitude into number 10 Downing Street. Margaret Thatcher's strengths were her conviction, her clarity, and her determination. She was one of the most determined people. Some would call her stubborn, but she was fiercely determined. She had strong convictions and she would not change. And this is likely what made her so popular with US President Ronald Reagan and with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It is likely that Margaret Thatcher played that key role between Reagan and Gorbachev that really changed the world order and dissolved the Cold War. And it was this determination, this conviction, that allowed her to do that. But at the same time, she had specific weaknesses that she carried throughout her life and throughout her time as prime minister. And that was social division, unemployment, and a leadership style that alienated many. The Iron Lady was iron for a reason. She was not your touchy-feely aristocratic leader. She was who she was, and she didn't apologize for it, not even for 1 second. Again, I've always been fascinated with the British royal family, and so Debbie and I watched the multiple episode series called The Crown. And the episode that features Margaret Thatcher's relationship with the Queen was a quite interesting episode because it highlights this dynamic between the monarch and the prime minister. It's actually very profound. Remember, up until this point in time, Queen Elizabeth had had prime ministers, beginning with Winston Churchill, that there might have been differences, but for the most part, shared her background and her worldview. They shared this aristocratic empire building mentality. But Margaret Thatcher was the opposite of that. And there's a scene in The Crown where Margaret Thatcher early in her reign as prime minister, visits Balmoral Castle, which we know is in Scotland, and it was uh, not as much the Queen's favorite place to go as the Queen Mother's favorite place. But um, in this episode, Margaret Thatcher and her husband visit the royal family at Balmoral. And from the beginning, Prime Minister Thatcher is very uncomfortable. The royals are playing games, they're dancing, they're doing all of these things. And all Margaret Thatcher wanted to do is work. She felt like the time at Balmoral Castle, drinking wine and and walking through the Scottish moors and dancing in huge ballrooms was an absolute waste. She wanted to change the country. And so this dynamic with the royals didn't fit her style at all because, as symbolic leaders of the country, they were very much steeped in the royal culture. And that wasn't a culture that Margaret Thatcher understood, appreciated, or was willing to participate in. And so she had to force herself to do that. But as I said, the relationship with the Queen improved, and ultimately they became, if not friends, at least people who could respect each other's worldviews. Even today, the public perception of Margaret Thatcher remains divided. Supporters see her as a visionary who saved Britain from decline. But critics see her as a leader who inflicted unnecessary hardship. Her legacy is still hotly debated and likely always will be. I've sat in a room of friends who are British, and you throw out the name Margaret Thatcher, and I promise you an argument is going to ensue. Because there are going to be people on both sides and not very many people in the middle. They have either an almost eclectic view of Margaret Thatcher or one that is borderline hatred. And as I said, there's very little in between that. But here's what I think that we can all agree on, whether British or certainly those like myself sitting from the outside, is that Margaret Thatcher, from the standpoint of dissolving the Cold War or ending the Cold War, was the right leader at the right time to hit the international stage, to work with Gorbachev and Reagan to change the trajectory of the world. And for that, I think that she will always deserve huge respect. As a matter of fact, when I've gone around the world and talked about Margaret Thatcher, it's almost universally in other countries respect for the Iron Lady. More respect than she gets in Britain, as a matter of fact. Because they didn't see the hardship and the dogma and the visceral qualities that Thatcher brought to the table. What they saw, especially Eastern Europeans, is that she and Reagan and Gorbachev did something that no one thought could be done, and that's dissolve the Warsaw Pact. Of course, after Margaret Thatcher came John Major. And if you had to sum up John Major, you would probably say he was a decent man in difficult times. He was, from a personality standpoint, I don't know that anybody could have been more opposite than Margaret Thatcher. John Major was quieter, more conciliatory. He brought calm leadership, where Margaret Thatcher's leadership was always a cauldron, always drama, always confrontation. Major brought something very much different than that. And he also made progress in the Northern Ireland peace efforts and stabilized the economy, which really was finally the undoing of Margaret Thatcher. The bad economy was really the last straw after 11 years as prime minister for her administration. And so John Major jumped into that and began to stabilize the economy. John Major was a quiet calm after the storm of Thatcher. And that's why I believe that he had such a close relationship with Queen Elizabeth, because he very much mirrored her leadership style. He was more participatory, more conciliatory, calmer, quieter. This is exactly what Queen Elizabeth appreciated. Now, she learned a great deal from the bombastic style of Winston Churchill when she was younger, and from the resilience and conflict oriented and and dogmatic leadership of Margaret Thatcher. She learned from them. But John Major was much more suited to her style. He was a decent man, and she considered him to be a decent man. And that's why, of all the prime ministers since Winston Churchill, John Major was very likely the Queen's favorite. She liked him very much. They had a close relationship. The British public's perception of John Major is gentle. He's remembered even today as a decent, understated, and often underrated prime minister. And that's interesting because no one would would conceive that Margaret Thatcher would have either been understated or underrated. She was who she was, and she did things her way. And if you didn't like it, then you knew where the highway was that led out of town. But the conversations that I've had with my friends in Britain and those who know much more about the history of British leadership than I do, virtually all of them, regardless of which party they support, will say that John Major was a decent man who tried to do the right thing and has likely never gotten the credit that he deserved. After John Major came someone who's very familiar to all of us, and that's Tony Blair. Tony Blair was Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1997 to 2007. And if you could sum up Blair, it would be the modern charismatic leader. Much different than John Major. Blair was a centrist. He was Labor, but he was a centrist. And he developed the Labor Party into more of a centrist modern party. He had great vision for the country, and he was extremely, extremely pragmatic. He was a great communicator. He had a lot of energy. And this allowed his Labor government to oversee economic growth, social reforms, and of course, the Good Friday Agreement, which was one of the most significant peace agreements in modern history with Northern Ireland. But Blair had some blind spots. No one's perfect, and Blair certainly wasn't. Remember what happened during this period. 2001 happened, September 11th, 2001, when the United States was attacked, a key ally of Britain. And George W. Bush called on Tony Blair to be part of the coalition that would go into Afghanistan and ultimately Iraq to address the issues that came out of 9/11. And this decision by Blair to join the Iraq War remains, even today in Britain, deeply controversial. And to a large degree, overshadowed his domestic achievements and reshaped his legacy. Of course, he also, during this period of time, was the death of Princess Diana. And Tony Blair, as prime minister, understood even more so, it seems, than the Queen, as to what Diana meant to not just the British public, but to the world. It's said, and again, I'm not in the British inner circle, but it's said that it was Tony Blair who convinced Queen Elizabeth to come back from Balmoral Castle and to publicly address the nation about Princess Diana's death. And she truly, evidently, didn't understand the type of reaction that the British government or that the British people and the world would have to Diana. And it perplexed her. But it wasn't lost on Tony Blair. And so he became really that liaison between the Queen and the British public who helped navigate the death of this iconic woman. So the public perception of Tony Blair is complex. He was a younger leader. He was an innovative leader. He was very articulate. And this created sometimes some friction between he and the monarch, but also between he and the British public. Everyone appreciated his charisma and his ability to be transformative. Yet, Blair's legacy will be permanently tied to a war that divided the nation. I had the opportunity to meet Tony Blair in years later, after he was prime minister, in both Jerusalem, where his foundation, the Blair Foundation, was deeply involved in trying to broker peace in Israel and Palestine. So I met him in Jerusalem at one point. I met him again in the lobby of a hotel in Pristina, Kosovo, of all places, where he was also very much involved in the rebuilding and rebranding of that company, or of that country rather. And I also consulted for the Tony Blair Institute in Iraq, where I worked with TBI on enhancing the investment environment in Ukraine. So I'm very I have some close connections with, and remain to have close connections with, the Tony Blair Institute. So the two very brief times that I met Tony Blair, it was I saw what everybody else saw: his charisma, his easy smile, his ability to make you think that you were the only person in the room that was worth talking to. He just had that manner about him, which was both a strength and a weakness. So after Tony Blair, there there emerged a leader who was again quite the opposite of Tony Blair in terms of style and personality. His name was Gordon Brown. He had formerly been uh, counselor for the Exchequer, which is the equivalent of the minister or the secretary of commerce or the minister of finance in European countries. Um, Gordon Brown served from 2007 to 2010 as prime minister. And if you summed up Gordon Brown, it would probably be the reluctant leader. Brown was brilliant, likely a genius, uh, a very cerebral type of leader. Quiet, tenacious, serious. I have a good friend who's British tell me that Gordon Brown's undoing ultimately was the fact that he struggled with communication, especially mass communication, where Tony Blair had been all about mass communication. Gordon Brown was the opposite. But my friend told me if Gordon Brown could have talked to everyone in Britain one on one, he might have been one of the most successful prime ministers in history. Because one on one, he could communicate his values, he could communicate his vision, where he had a hard time, even within his own party, was communicating in a broad way. And this eroded the unity of the party and created uh, a lot of political fallout as recession descended on Britain. Remember, Gordon Brown was prime minister during the global economic crisis of 2008. And it hit Britain hard, just like it did every other country. And Brown's policies, even though he was a savant in finance, his policies were either insufficient or at least insufficiently communicated to help the British public understand how this could rejuvenate their economy. Quite frankly, if you look at Brown's policies, his economic policies, he was playing the long game. And if allowed to continue as prime minister, he very likely would have put policies in place that would have strengthened Britain's economy well into the future. But the problem was Gordon Brown was playing the long game at the time that Britain needed him to play the short game because their economy was in deep trouble. And because he couldn't communicate the depths of his understanding of finance and his policies, his his um, administration as prime minister spun out of control. Again, he had a good relationship with the Queen, not a warm relationship like she had with John Major, not the mentor mentee relationship she had with Winston Churchill, not the warm relationship she had with prime ministers like Macmillan, who came from her world. But she and Brown got along well because he was a quiet, reflective leader. Um, but he was much more cerebral in the way that he led than other prime ministers. And at times, that was somewhat off putting, I think, to Queen Elizabeth. But it was certainly off putting to a lot of his peers and the public. Today, most of my friends in Britain, who again know much more about this topic than I do, see Brown as someone who's sympathetic. He was a leader that was defined by a crisis, and a man whose intellect outshone his political instincts. Given his druthers, I think Gordon Brown would just have been left alone to work the numbers, and he would have been fine. But in the top leadership job of the nation, he was ill suited to be able to navigate the political um, journey that he had to take. And this led to the rise of David Cameron, who was Prime Minister of Britain from 2010 to 2016. And if you summed up David Cameron, it would likely be the modern conservative. Cameron projected a polished, pragmatic conservatism. He oversaw economic recovery. He introduced social reforms. He tried to modernize his party. But like other prime ministers before him, he had a big Achilles heel that affected his legacy. And of course, the big issue, one of the biggest issues during his time as prime minister was Brexit. And to this day, outside of Margaret Thatcher, I can't think of another prime minister, maybe Keir Starmer, and we'll get to him in just a few moments, but I can't think of another prime minister that will elicit the kind of debate that David Cameron will. And this is because this issue of Brexit was so contentious. And Cameron, most scholars believe, had no intention of Britain leaving the European Union. But he promised when he became prime minister that he would let the people decide. And so he put Brexit on the ballot, thinking that this would end the discussion, that the people of Britain would vote to remain in the European Union. That would end the debate. They could move on. Of course, what happened was that the British public did not elect to stay. By 52% to 48% vote, they elected to leave the European Union, which created panic and mayhem within the Cameron government and caused him to resign. It was a huge miscalculation. He literally, it was like playing poker and going all in with a pair of deuces. Or maybe that maybe overstates it a little bit. It was like going all in with a couple of aces and maybe a king high when your opponent had three aces. It was a gamble, and he lost. And he lost big. Now, we'll have a whole episode on Brexit, so I'm not going to really deal with the fallout of Brexit here, both the good and the bad. But what we know is that this was the undoing of the Cameron government. He placed a bet that he couldn't win. And that's why public perception of him is so mixed. He was certainly seen as capable and modern, yet he was undone by one decision that has become one of the most debated decisions in the history of British politics and likely in the history, of the European Union. And so after Cameron came Theresa May. Again, my friends in Britain, the jury's out on Theresa May. I've always contended I think she was in a no-win situation. She was in a situation where it was impossible for her to build the kind of legacy that she wanted to build. If you summed up Theresa May in a few words, it would be the steady negotiator. She inherited the impossible task of delivering Brexit, and she worked diligently at it, seriously, with a sense of duty. And the Queen respected Theresa May's sense of duty. She didn't have that kind of relationship with Cameron, by the way. Her relationship with Cameron was cordial, but never probably warm. With Theresa May, the Queen respected her ability to negotiate and the fact that she had the same type of sense of duty that the Queen did. And this sense of duty caused Theresa May to try to negotiate and implement something that she did not believe in herself. She was a Remainer. She faced parliamentary deadlock, party rebellion, failed negotiations, and her leadership became defined as frustration rather than achievement. Because at this point in time, the European Union was embarrassed. They were angry. They felt like that Britain's exit of the European Union could spread to other disgruntled nations and really unravel the European Union as they knew it. And they were not inclined to give Britain any space to negotiate. And that's why Theresa May was almost in a no-win situation, because she was expected to deliver Brexit the way those who voted for it wanted, and yet the European Union thwarted her at every turn, I believe, out of pure spite. Now, you know that I am not a fan of the European Union. I think they jumped the shark when they became a political rather than an economic union. And so I wasn't surprised at all when, after Brexit happened, the European Union responded the way they did. Because the European Union is largely style over substance. And their visibility means everything to them. Their reputation means everything. Their bureaucracy means everything. And to have somebody crash out, to have someone, a country like Britain, say, we're out, was not going to go without some type of punishment. So Theresa May's term as prime minister was really almost over before it started. She lasted from 2016 through 2019. But the public today considers May's administration to be respectful, and they're sympathetic to it. They still see her as hardworking, but she was overwhelmed and she was trapped by circumstance. And then came the indomitable, polarizing figure of Boris Johnson, who was prime minister from 2019 through 2022. I met Boris Johnson briefly in Ukraine, and he's as bombastic and as iconic as one can believe. He was the showman. If you summed it up, the showman. He brought the charisma, the humor, the boldness back to number 10 Downing Street. He completed Brexit through sheer force of will. He also led during the pandemic, and he maintained strong communication during the public. And he was I will always respect him because of the great friend that he was to the Ukrainians in the days after the full scale invasion, where literally he was the person on the European continent, the leader on the European continent that never wavered in his support to Ukraine. But Boris Johnson's government was a lot like his life. It was filled with drama, filled with scandals, internal conflict, questions about trust. His leadership style was energetic, but it was chaotic. It divided public opinion. It was nonstop drama and chaos. It was, the inmates in some cases were running the asylum. And that's created strong differences in public perception of Boris Johnson. Admirers see him as a dynamic leader, but critics see him as an irresponsible leader that just created panic and mayhem everywhere he went. His style was the antithesis of the Queen. She was later in her life then, and passed away not long after Boris Johnson left as prime minister. And so her leadership capacities were somewhat diminished by that time. But Boris Johnson was someone who was almost Tony Blair on steroids. He had the charisma, but Blair had the ability to navigate a political system in a way that was that maintained order. Where Boris Johnson, at least a perception was by many that he stumbled around the room like Baby Huey, just tearing things up or breaking things that weren't broken so that he could fix them. And that was certainly not the Queen's style. And being later in her life and somewhat diminished, she probably never had the chance to build the kind of relationship with Boris Johnson that she had with some of the other prime ministers. So this bombastic leader, Boris Johnson, moves off the scene. And then a replacement came in the form of Liz Truss, who is the shortest serving prime minister in British history. You could sum her administration up as a brief experiment. And just like David Cameron gambled and lost on Brexit, Liz Truss gambled and lost on her bold vision of economic reform. Liz Truss came to number 10 Downing Street with a specific economic model in her mind that she felt would reform the British economy in a way that not only could it survive Brexit, but that it could flourish. The challenge with Liz Truss was twofold. Number one, she had very significant problems articulating that economic vision. And secondly, once she did articulate it, the markets reacted violently. Her policies triggered instability, political backlash, and ultimately loss of confidence from even those in her own party. And this led to her departure as prime minister after just a few months. What's the public perception? Well, it's a cautionary tale, really. Because Liz Truss was ideological in her view of how Britain's economy could be transformed. But the speed at which she tried to move created the angst and the conflict that led to her demise. Liz Truss was prime minister when Queen Elizabeth passed, and that was probably the as far as her leadership goes, her leadership and uh, her memorialization of the Queen is probably the one thing that you can find positive to say about Liz Truss. Otherwise, it was almost a mitigated disaster. Now, that's not to say that she was totally wrong, but the way she approached the economic reform was not appropriate for the time and was her undoing. She was not a Gordon Brown that believes slow and steady wins the race. She was not that cerebral figure that could articulate her vision. She was also not charismatic and dynamic like Boris Johnson and Tony Blair. And all of those things converged to her quick undoing as prime minister. And this led to the rise of Rishi Sunak, whose administration served from 2022 to 24. Sunak was a technocrat. He brought calm, competence, and economic expertise. He focused after this period of instability rather under Truss to bring stability and address the challenges of post-Brexit. He especially attacked inflation. But in doing so, he faced party division, economic strain, and really public fatigue. The public was just worn out. They were tired. They were tired of the nonsense. They'd seen, they'd gone through the chaos of Boris Johnson. They'd seen Liz Truss implode. Rishi Sunak really had no chance to make his mark as prime minister. Public perception of those that are my friends in Britain and who know these things is respectful, but it's reserved. He's seen as capable, but he was constrained by circumstance. And so after Rishi Sunak came the rise of Keir Starmer. People saw him as the restorer. He was the person who was going to restore not only the economy of Britain, but the credibility of the Labour Party. Starmer's leadership was defined by professionalism, seriousness, and really a desire to restore the trust in government among average Britons. His legal background shaped his approach. He's methodical, careful, and grounded. He had many strengths, which included stabilization, pragmatic policies, and an increase in credibility of the government. But he suffered from high expectations, economic constraints, and criticism from both wings of his party. And one of his major undoings was immigration. It's widely perceived that Keir Starmer's policies on immigration had led to the significant challenges that Britain is having today with migrants and the economic constraints, the crime, the social issues that have come with them. Now, it certainly wasn't just Keir Starmer, but he gained a lot of the blame for that. So public perception of Starmer, who was forced out of office very recently, is that he was soft on immigration while waffling on his support for Ukraine. He presided over challenging economic times for Britain and diminishing world influence. And of course, that ultimately led to his undoing. So we've taken quite a journey today from Winston Churchill to Keir Starmer. And as of the recording of this podcast, a permanent replacement for Keir Starmer has not yet been elected by the Labour Party. And we don't know yet whether there will be a snap election or not. But the journey that we've taken from Churchill's wartime war to Starmer's modern pragmatism is quite an interesting one. British prime ministers have guided the nation through crisis, conflict, and change. Each brought certain strengths, they carried also certain weaknesses, and each reflected the mood of their era. Leadership's not simple, it's never perfect, but it's always revealing. And for me, a kid from rural Oklahoma who once waved at the Queen in wearing her bright pink hat, British leaders have always felt like characters in a story that I've been reading my whole life. And I hope that you were even a tenth as fascinated by the information in this episode as I was. Sorry for the length of this one. It's a longer one than usual, but I hope that you enjoyed this walk through Britain's leadership at the prime minister position from Churchill to Starmer. Join me next week on some stops along the way. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you soon.